This is Fintech Takes, the podcast keeping you in the loop on all the latest fintech trends, news, and ideas. I'm Alex Johnson, creator of the Fintech Takes newsletter, your host and self-confessed fintech nerd. Let's go! Hello, and welcome to a very special mini-series here at Fintech Takes, a series that we're calling Killing It. This is a podcast that my friend Jason Henrichs of Alloy Labs and Breaking Banks and I decided to do because we were tired of only hearing stories in entrepreneurship about success, about things going up and to the right, when in fact, the vast majority of entrepreneurial experiences don't go that well. Normally, they end a little bit in a whimper rather than a bang. Sometimes you have to shut down your company. Sometimes you have to find an exit, or sometimes you personally just have to step away from something that you've dedicated a large chunk of your life to. This podcast is about those stories. Our first episode features just me and Jason talking about the series, and Jason, who was a co-founder of Perk Street, one of the very first neobanks in the world, sharing some of his observations from his experience going through that shutdown process and what it felt like, and then teeing up the rest of the series where we're going to talk to entrepreneurships across fintech. Some you know, some you don't, where we're going to talk about their failures and what they learned killing it. So please enjoy.
Alex, thanks for joining me on the new series. I'd like to say I'm excited about it, but maybe pensive is a better word. We hear so much about the unicorns and everything in a world that went up and to the right. I think 2023 was a great realization that everything does not go up and to the right. And yes. I would say 2024 is a realization there is no silver lining per se, that everything is guaranteed a soft landing. And so if we talk about how I built this, this is kind of the antithesis of how I built this. This is how I did not build this. This is how I failed this. This is how I crushed this, or is where we got the title for this is how I killed it. Actually, yes. Dan O'Malley and I, back in the day when Perk Street was a high flyer, and the reality was our investors were walking away, and everyone's like, "How's it going?" And we like, "We're killing it."
Yep.
Literally, we're killing it is what we're saying inside. Like literally the business is dying because a series of choices we're being forced to make.
Totally.
But we struggle to say that. So this is the podcast on entrepreneurs who are going to come in and talk about tough decisions, that they've made. Come lay down on our virtual couch.
Yes. No, I mean, you and I are not licensed therapists, but I think we do recognize that there is sort of this unhealthy vibe in the fintech ecosystem, which is particularly coming out of 2020 and 2021, when I've compared it to like when you'd play Mario and you'd get a star and you could just run through the level and just bash through whatever objects were in your way, and like nothing could stop you or slow you down. You're like, I'm amazing at Mario. I mean, entrepreneurship generally, it's not like that most of the time, right? And in particular, in the waters that we swim in and in fintech with, venture capital investors and people looking for unicorns and big exits, like that's a high stakes game where there's a high rate of failure, right? And I think that so much of what we see just sort of shared publicly, and this is what I see on Twitter, this is like the kind of discourse that I see a lot is, well, here's how you get to peak performance. Here's what success looks like. Here's how you have to grind away. And the other side of that is, what does it feel like when you've been grinding away and doing all the things you're supposed to do, quote unquote, to build a great startup? And then for reasons that, have to do with the choices you made, but also reasons that have to do with just the broader environment and timing and luck and all these random things, what does it feel like to grind away and then get to the end and you didn't get to where you wanted, or where you did kill the thing that you were trying to build, or you do have to deliver terrible news to, your co-founder or your early employees who believed in you? Like, what does that feel like? And how do you bounce back from that? I mean, I think those are the questions we're trying to answer. And I think the thing that's cool about fintech is, and this is what we're going to be hopefully exploring in this series, there are a lot of awesome people who have these type of stories, right? You have this story with Perk Street. There's a whole bunch of other folks in the industry who've gotten knocked down to the mat multiple times and have gotten back up and can explain to us like in detail in pain what that feels like and what it takes to kind of walk away from that.
I get quite a few, DMs or people who have my email reach out to talk about this, and they do feel like they're alone. And I'll be honest, like the story I told coming out of Perk Street was not 100% the reality. Just like killing it was factually correct. We were killing it. But the reinvention piece of it, because there was so much shame associated with having been so publicly meteoric rise, and then little known fact, I don't know that everyone knows this, but you find it if you Google the somewhat buried. One of our big partners was Dave Ramsey, which I got a whole other set of stories to be telling about that one. But he went so far when we were in the sales process and we kept him abreast. He went on his radio show, like him or not, has quite a following.
Oh yeah,
he called Dan and I slime bags, and that we deserve to be dead, which also made for a pretty interesting response. We had to actually hire security at Perk Street at the door, because we had rabid followers who turned more rabid than fans.
That's crazy.
And it's interesting when you think about the rebirth. I don't often share this. I don't think I've ever put it on camera publicly. So one year at Dave's holiday party, he gave me, you can see here, as you zoom in, a Dave Ramsey special. He had a cask of Blanton's in it, and knew I love my bourbon, done. And you will note this has not been opened, right?
Yep.
It's not been digested, but it has sat on my desk now for 8 years. I call it my FU Dave Ramsey bottle of bourbon. And I look back at that bottle of bourbon all the time and I say, I don't know what success it is, or when I'm at the end of the journey that I'm actually going to open this and have a drink, but I've proven to myself I can claw my way back. And I think that's part of the message.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I mean, I think that, to add to that, I mean, one of the things that people don't talk about a lot with this stuff is there's a lot of like vulnerability associated with this, right? Because, and I felt a version of this, with Fintech Takes, but there's something very scary about saying, this is an idea I have for a thing that should exist. Like the world should be different in this specific way. And like, pursuing that idea, pushing that idea out there, getting like really, really aggressive, in your case with Dave Ramsey, pushback on this vision that you have for the world, it not, again, working out or things not going exactly the way that you had anticipated. And it's funny, failure looks different to everybody, right? I mean, I have definitely talked to founders, and I'm sure you have too, where they ended up getting acquired. Financially, they did okay. Their employees ended up at a new place with stable employment. And they feel like a failure because like the thing they had in mind was a different exit or was going public or was doing something else. And so I think in a lot of cases, and this is something I'm looking forward to exploring in this series, like what were your expectations going into this? And how did reality and those expectations smash into each other? Because, feeling like a failure, feeling that shame is a lot of times a function as much of our expectations as it is about anything else.
Yeah. And the expectation setting, I think, is an important part. One of the guests we have coming up to tease out storied bio when you look at the products and companies he has been involved in. And yet one of the things he shares as we were prepping, asking him to be on the series, was each time letting go of that, how difficult it was.
Yeah.
And it makes me think the analogy, almost of letting go of like a part of your life, whether it be like the letting go of college, that was a period, or the post-college, or relationships or friendships, right? Like there's a sense of loss. And one of the consistent themes that is, or words that has come up as we've been doing prep for this is, whether it's an exit, a good exit or a bad exit, whether it is exiting, but the company goes on, is the grieving process.
Yes.
That goes with this.
Yep. Yeah, no, well, and I think that the other concept that's tied right into that that you just hit on really well. I like the analogy of like when you're in college, as an example, you build your identity around this stuff, right? And I think that it's not at all unhealthy, I don't think, to like wrap your identity around what you're doing or what you're trying to build or what you're trying to accomplish. And it does feel like a part of your life and like a phase of your life because again, talking these entrepreneurship stories, you're eating at Subway every night because you're literally trying to scrimp and save every last dollar and like preserve this like time in your life. And that's like really resonant. It becomes a part of like who you are. And, much like any other type of loss that you have to grieve, like part of it is you're grieving a change in your identity and sort of how you conceive of yourself. And so I think it is so interesting. And I am looking forward in this series to talking to people who are at different stages of that, right? Because we're going to be talking to serial entrepreneurs who've been through this a lot of times and have a lot of scar tissue build up. We're going to be talking to folks who walked away from companies that are still doing well and are still in business because just personally for them, they couldn't kind of continue along that path any longer. We'll talk to people who've been through their first failure from an entrepreneurship perspective, and it's still like a very fresh wound. And everyone has sort of a different sort of experience based on where they are in that journey, kind of letting go of those identities.
Yeah, I mean, I wish you and I had had this conversation 8 years ago because I feel like it would have been helpful to realize how much of the loss that I was feeling was that loss of identity.
Yeah.
And we did a double whammy is that my wife wanted to get out of Boston. We moved back to the Midwest to a place where like
Right.
literally knew no one,
Yeah.
in terms of who we worked with. And the upside, people didn't know the backstory, but I also felt like a person without an identity. Like
Totally.
my identity was my golden retriever.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. You're sort of like, you're like clinging to these last things that can be a part of your identity while trying to build something new. And I'm glad you mentioned the moving thing, actually, because that's the other thing that hopefully will kind of come up or that we can explore in this series a bit. But I'm actually fascinated by how entrepreneurship and location are sort of connected to each other and maybe becoming somewhat unmoored from each other because, I think for many founders, their experience founding a company is really tied to a place, right? San Francisco, New York, Boston, wherever. But also, I mean, this is a legacy of coming out of 2020 and 2021. We're seeing a lot more kind of remote work or hybrid companies or starting up in kind of interesting locations. And, talk about like feeling lost or feeling like lonely. I mean, at least when you were starting a company sort of in the old world where everyone was in the same room, which still a lot of people do, like at least there's sort of a bonding experience there. I can't imagine starting a company now and being remote and just sitting like alone in an office. So there's all these layers to the experience of going through this and how it's kind of changed. And I can't wait to unpack that.
Yeah, well, and compound that with the number of solopreneurs.
Totally.
I think back to early, first in my entrepreneurial, then VC journey, and back to entrepreneurial, almost always you had a founding team. And so more often now, especially, I think things started in ZERP where money would flow to an individual, or you might have a founding team, but it really was a founder and somewhat of a team. Like I can't imagine going through Perk Street again without like Dan. Like
Totally.
his daughter, who's now old enough to joke about it, used to assume anytime he was on the phone late at night, like he was talking to me because like that's what we did. And it was not only the strategic and tactical, but it was the, how do we weather this?
Yes. No, I mean, and I think that that's a really, really good point about just the experience that you go through. And even like, I mean, another element to this that I'm fascinated by, and this kind of is a contrast between the ZERP years and now that we're sort of out of those, but, the idea of like bootstrapping versus raising money, right? And I talk to lots of founders all the time who will describe different parts of the entrepreneurial journey really differently, right? And so they'll talk about, oh yeah, when we were building the product or when we were talking to users, it was like amazing and it was hard, and it was stressful, but it was so energizing. And then they'd be like, and then we had to go into fundraising mode. And like that's a totally different, like it's like downshifting almost. And it was super stressful, and we had to go talk to investors, and we weren't sure what the right timing was. And we were trying to time the market. And so I think the other part of this that's so hard is, to your point, there are all of these different ways of doing it, right? There's not like one playbook for building a business. And the decisions that you have to live with are, and we're going to talk to some other folks about some of these hard decisions. At the time, our thinking was, oh, the environment is X, we can raise whenever, everything's going great, we just want to stay heads down. But with the benefit of hindsight, turns out that was exactly the wrong decision. But again, even for serial entrepreneurs, there's no way in the moment to know which of those decisions are going to be good and which are going to be bad. You just have to live with them in retrospect, which is really hard.
Even if you've done it before,
totally.
History is no secret roadmap for what the right decision is the next time. I do think we discounted the value of experience in thinking through these things, but it's not perfect.
No, and actually, maybe the shame might be even more for someone who's been through it a couple of times and then still kills it and finds out that, like, wow, as much as I thought I had learned about this experience, turns out, yeah, like entrepreneurship is hard every single time you do it, and experience isn't a perfect guide to what to do in the future.
Yeah. And I feel this so often now relegated to the investor role and, advisor role with CEOs and coming and saying, thinking through this decision, what should we do? It still gives me that moment of kind of panic, right? Like I'm not the one who ultimately has to live with the decision, but just how hard it is.
Oh, yeah.
When those begin to feel like life and death. And I think that becomes particularly painful when you're facing decisions that, could ultimately lead to death. I think the one that
absolutely
every entrepreneur and, especially first-time entrepreneurs wrestle with is downsizing, getting budgets right.
Yep.
It's hard, especially people who've given so much to get you where you are.
Well, and I think that's a really good one where it's like, and I've been through this a few times personally, it's not necessarily the fault of anyone, right? Like it's always easier when there's like a very clear, like, oh, we're going to do this because you screwed up. And like that's a very different experience, and it's tough, but like you can probably live with it. The one that's really hard is having to tell people who gave everything for your business and your idea, who did everything that you asked and did it well, it's not going to work, right? And like that's and a lot of times the reason it's not going to work is because of a decision that I made where I screwed something up. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like the weight of responsibility being in this type of role is just incredibly hard, and something that, again, we don't talk about. We glorify the upsides to it, right? And there are really fun parts. I mean, I'm sure you had a lot of those experiences at Perk Street too. Like when you're riding high, it absolutely feels amazing. It's funny. It kind of reminds me a little bit, and you and I talk about this a lot offline, but the entrepreneurship journey feels a lot like parenting, I think, in a way where it's like, because I don't know if you remember this, because I know your kids are now a little bit older, and like, your brain sort of causes you to forget these things. But I remember when we brought home our eldest son from the hospital, that first night, like the level of sheer panic you feel where it's like, I am responsible for keeping this thing alive and I have no idea what I'm doing. Like it's a magical experience in a way. And so you can sort of understand how people get addicted to entrepreneurship, or in my case, having more kids, but like, there is something sort of cool about like that level of responsibility and that level of engagement, but man, is it stressful.
It's interesting thinking about the parenting piece of this.
Yeah.
The challenge isn't just the baby. The challenge is the number of stakeholders you have invested in the baby, in the expectation.
Who are giving you advice on like, hey, I used to have kids. This is the grandparents. And like, that's not how we did it. Or are you sure you want to do that? And it's like, I know you want the best. I know you're just like, you're invested in this round and like, you just want to see this company succeed. But like, could you back off and just let me do this? You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure that comes up all the time.
Yeah, with my luck, this will be like the episode my mother decides to listen, or my sister decides to listen. I say, like, in right before COVID, we moved to Minnesota into my parents' basement while we looked for a house and then did a
Oh, sure.
renovation. And there's nothing like raising children like under your mother's nose.
I've never had that experience, and I hopefully never will. That sounds intense.
Right. And I think we see this online and in person when people talk about the struggles. The challenge becomes the like, are you going to get the like? Wouldn't say you're doing it wrong, but you're like, what did I do? I can tell you're not happy. I'm like, oh, I don't want to tell you what to do. I'm just saying.
Well, and the analogy is a really good one, actually, between sort of the grandparents and the investors, because the other problem is the investors are who they are because they probably succeeded, right? They probably built a great company, had a great exit, like they have a great track record. And so as a founder, I'm sure you look at it and go, like, when you go that sound like, oh God, like maybe I am screwing up. And like maybe like they clearly know what they're doing. And I feel this way, I mean, sort of egotistical, but I feel this way with my parents because like I'm awesome and my parents raised me. And so like clearly they have a track record of raising great humans. And so like if I'm screwing something up, like I don't want to do that. So there is this like weird pressure that you feel from that larger ecosystem, to say nothing of the fact, and I promise I won't stretch the parenting analogy too far, but like one other point on this is there is a broader industrial complex wrapped around all of this, right? Which is, from a parenting perspective, like how to not screw up your kids, how to not raise assholes. Like there's all these like sort of like larger forces putting pressure on you. And I see that same thing with entrepreneurship and, tech startups and, just like the industrial complex of performance coaches and, advice from, sort of thought leaders in quotes on Twitter about how to build companies and how to build businesses and all the things you're doing wrong. And so to the extent that you can like drown out the noise immediately around you, there's still a broader ecosystem that's putting like a ton of pressure on you for how to do things the right way.
Yeah. And fleshing out that ecosystem that can be hard, admitting to your friends, family, to your spouse that the thing that you sacrificed so much for wasn't going to come to fruition.
Yeah.
I think, and then like, let's keep layering on. You have to let employees know. You have to let angels know who wrote the first checks for you, some of which you may be related to. My uncle / godfather was the first angel check I ever received back in 1999. For a good 20 years, every year on my birthday, I got a card from him saying, I would have given you money, but you already lost some. And, like it was not as much as, he himself was a successful entrepreneur. He got it. It was tongue in cheek, but like you felt that weight.
Oh, for sure.
You have to tell your investors. And, they might be professional investors, meaning they have somebody else's money they're investing, but it's still hard. And I do see a tendency on all of these fronts. And we'll have Matt Harris of Bloom Credit on at some point to talk about, him leaving Bloom and what he's doing now with coaching, entrepreneurs around this. Is the tendency is to kind of like jump on the ball and hope, like you recover from it, versus like those hard truths. And it's actually the absolute wrong thing to be doing. I can tell you from experience, both my own and hearing from others, is you actually need that ecosystem. And it's going to be a lot healthier, not only as an individual, but I think you'll realize the people that rally to you and are more supportive than you might expect might actually get you in the right place.
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, just to sort of end on a sort of up note, because some of this stuff is pretty intense, and we'll be talking to folks who are going to share hopefully some stuff that's pretty personal and in some cases big challenges that people have been going through. But I do think we are also hoping to highlight like what that looks like when you find out people who are really truly invested in you and not just like your business or trying to get a good return on their investment, or finding employees that you had who follow you to the next company and the next company after that and the next company after that. And I think there are a lot of those really cool stories that come out of this that, again, like they're not shared because they're part of a larger story about failure, but there's some of the most meaningful parts of your life over time are the people that you find during failure and the lessons that you learn from that. So I think we're going to try to highlight those as well. And, hopefully this is a pro entrepreneurship, pro trying new things and getting off the mat podcast at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's about the rebirth. And that rebirth
Exactly.
doesn't necessarily mean another successful startup, right? Or an exit, or, an Amanda Payton, hey, let's, pick
Let's
up
do
the
this
phoenix
again.
from the ashes,
Mhm.
literally, pick it up and, reinvent the business itself. I mean, the number of times that I've thought, oh, should I do Park Street 2.0 and then,
Yeah.
dismissed it. That isn't necessarily the path, but some of the journeys we'll have on are people who walked away from entrepreneurship altogether
And
that
are
have ended
happier
up,
for it, right? Yeah.
right. And not everyone needs to be a founder. Not everyone needs to be an entrepreneur. Not everyone needs to work within fintech. That's not a failure. But I do
No.
think the entrepreneurial journey is one that many people do benefit from. If you,
Well, it teaches you something, right? Like whether you stay in it or not, you learn something from it.
yeah, exactly. And I think what I would love to come of this series is a safe place for people to share that journey and for the listeners to think through and go, oh, I'm not alone in doing that. The
Yeah.
failure is to stuff it, to not want to deal with it, to let
Yeah.
it affect my physical health, my mental health, my relationships, to what I do next. Do I fall out of the ecosystem altogether because, I feel like people are judging me in how, the approach. It's timely because I just listened to it this morning. The podcast of the guy who wrote The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F.
Yep.
And one of his life lessons he said that he thinks everyone needs to learn is other people spend far less time thinking about you than you do.
The spotlight effect, right? Where it's
right?
like you feel like everything is falling on you. I will tell you that was one of the greatest revelations that I had in my life was when that I finally figured that out. And of course it came like at the end of high school and I could have used it way before that, but like there are these moments where you realize, and you have to go through it. You have to come out the other side of it and go, you know what? Like I failed, the world didn't end. People aren't judging me based on this one thing that happened. In fact, a lot of times, I think you come out of these experiences depending on how you handle them. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of these stories better off, right? With a better reputation, with like lasting relationships. And, I think one thing I'm really curious to ask some of the entrepreneurs that we have on this series is what are decisions that you don't regret even though they didn't work out, right? Because like a lot of times I think with particularly these sort of early stage companies and building these things, you're sort of forced between choosing to do the thing that you think is the right thing to do versus the thing that might have slightly higher odds of keeping your company alive or stretching things out or whatever. And those are incredibly difficult decisions. And I'm so looking forward to hearing about how people sort of think about those decisions in retrospect and how they wrestled with them because, I'm not going to sit here and tell people there's a right way to do it or a wrong way to do it, but how you live with it is the thing I'm really curious about.
At the end of my first entrepreneurial journey, and a lot of lessons learned that I don't think most people know. So co-founded a company at 27 in biotech in the late 90s when biotech wasn't a thing and young founders weren't a thing. Lesson learned, founding a company with two brothers who are exceedingly close, like puts you in the middle of battles that they've been having since they were 5 and 6 years old together.
Yep.
Like physical wrestling was not an uncommon occurrence in the halls of US genomics. And it was actually Brad Feld had recommended someone they worked really closely with, a management consultants, as in consulted to management around leadership development, by the name of Artemis Chakowski. And this has stuck with me. So this is how many years later, 35 years. I don't actually want to how long that is. But one of the big things he brought up around company culture, and it's true of all relationships. I think when you worry about, will people work with me again? Will they invest in me again? Will they partner with me again? If I in my perception, fail now because it doesn't go the way I wanted. And what he said was, here's what defines life. It is the promises you make, the promises you keep, and more importantly, what happens when you have to remake or ask for forgiveness for promises that have been broken.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And it's one thing, and I think you and I will find this when we were kind of progressing through this series. I'm blown away constantly by just how small the fintech industry is, right? And I talk to people all the time about this, where it's like, the more deeply you get sort of embedded in the ecosystem, the more you realize you just keep running into the same people and you keep talking about the same stories. And like, and I think this is true everywhere. Like these ecosystems where great things get built are really small. And the currency of those ecosystems is relationships, to your point. And so like the relationship aspect to all of this, particularly contrasted with like how lonely the process is, I'm really interested to explore, because I think that's extremely well said. I mean, at the end of the day, will people work with you again? Will people work for you again? Will they jump off that entrepreneurial cliff with you again? Will they invest in your company again? It all is a function of those relationships, much more so than like, was it profitable or not? That's not how it works.
Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest, there are, as an investor, companies that have made money for me and I will never invest in again. Back to the how do you manage the relationship. You may have generated a return on my investment, but the journey was not worth it.
Yes.
And there are others that have lost money that I don't even need to know what you want to go do. I'm happy to like write a check because of how you handled that.
Yep, exactly. No, and I think that, again, and we'll be talking to folks who've been on this treadmill for a long time and are repeat entrepreneurs who keep going at it. I'm curious to talk to them about how that advantage compounds over time, because I think the overall goal you have, particularly if you're going to stick in entrepreneurship for a while, is you want to create unfair advantages for yourself over time. And I think compounding value of relationships is such an unfair advantage for people in the space. And if you're starting your entrepreneurship journey, or you're thinking about, hey, this isn't going well, I'm going to have to unwind this first, go at it, it's not going to work out. The choices you make about how you manage those relationships, these are the seeds of those compounding advantages that you're going to build over time, regardless of what you do next.
Absolutely. So for anyone who's listening, if you have a story you would like to hear told, drop it in the show notes, respond on Twitter, DM us. If you have a story you'd like to tell yourself about that journey, or even just a question, to ask either specific people or, us to poll, welcome, lay down on the psychologist couch here and, let's have a therapy session about fintech in the new era.
That's right. We have plenty of room on the couch. So we hope that you will join us.
Plenty of room. Thanks for being part of the journey with me here, Alex.
Yes, sir.
I feel better already.
Me too. Thank you for listening to this episode of Fintech Takes. Stay up to date with emerging companies and the latest fintech trends by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. And if you love Fintech Takes, please tell a friend.